And we are back with Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline. And our second guest today is
Ethel Barker. And Ethel is the daughter of a Danish Lutheran pastor, spent a happy childhood in Dwight, Illinois, rural Iowa between Cedar Falls and Dike, Salinas, California, and Des Moines, Iowa. Her degrees are AA from Grandview College, Des Moines, a BA, and MAT from University of Iowa. She taught remedial reading in junior high students, and in so doing recognized the need for books that educate while holding students' interest. At an early age, when two little girls were happily playing school, her sister taught her to read. Ever since, she has found great delight in books. She currently is with her husband, a retired high school principal in Iowa City. For the Love of Pete, an orphan train story was her first novel. The Andersens of Eden is her second. And I could really identify with this, because this was, I was born in 1935, so I was in that.
In Iowa.
So I was in that era that this is.
The Andersens of Eden. Welcome to Writers' Voices, Ethel.
Thank you so much.
Now, is this your childhood time period also, or?
Yes, I was 6 years old on Pearl Harbor Day in December of 1941.
Oh, so you're exactly the same age as Caroline.
Yep.
Is that right? That's wonderful.
Right. And what made you want to write a novel about that time?
Well, I had already written the book, For the Love of Pete, an orphan train story that took place in 1880, and I thought this time it would be fun to write of a period that I knew, and also I felt we're losing our World War II veterans so quickly. I wanted to write this book while we still had some of them. And the man to whom I dedicated the book, George Dane, is in a retirement home and is not really well. And I wanted very much to get his story in the book.
No, so the letters that the soldiers, the members of this family, wrote back to their sister mainly, but to their families, telling about their experiences in the war. How is that because of this gentleman that you knew all those things, that you could relate them?
No, the interview I got with George Dane was the one about the Battle of the Bulge. It's towards the end of the book, and so he was young when the war started, but he was in it, and his story I gave to Cousin Orville, who's not anything like George Dane. George Dane is a little more sophisticated fellow than Cousin Orville, but his story worked so well for Cousin Orville, so I used it.
Okay, so you had to research the other things about the battles and so forth.
Yes, most of it. I had two other people who contributed a lot. One was Danielle Zimmerman, who told me her experience with polio, because Stanley, one of the boys in the family, experiences polio and does recover, and she did too. Gave me a wonderful story that I used. And then the other one was Pat Kniebel, who told me about a member of her family who had been declared missing in action. And when the word came, they'd suffered, knowing that their family member was missing in action and thinking the worst. And then the word came back that, no, he was found, he was well, everything was all right. And she had told me how her brother had been so thrilled with the news that he ran barefoot to town and rang the church bell. So I used that also for Stanley to do in honor of his brother.
Well, I had two uncles in the war. One was a foot soldier in Germany, and he in the army, and he came out without a scratch. I still can't believe that. And he's still living. Yeah. And then my other uncle was a mechanic. He joined the Air Force, and he was in England, stationed in England. He was a mechanic on B-29s or whatever it was, the bombers. So he had some interesting stories to tell. So, I grew up hearing this stuff, and that's why I just loved. I read this book, couldn't put it down. It's just It's just great.
I have heard that from people of our age who do have personal stories, and I wish I had heard them all before I wrote the book. I've heard some good ones ever since.
Well,
you could write another book.
Yes, I could. Well, I am writing another one, but on another subject.
Okay, I have to tell you, I don't know how old I was when this newscaster, was it H.V. Kaltenborn?
Yes.
He had a very distinctive voice and presentation. I used to imitate him.
Can you still do it?
No, because I can't
Come on, Mom.
I can't remember what he sounded like, but my mother couldn't tell if it was him or me.
Oh.
I've always been able to imitate, things.
See, that would have been a fun little detail to put in too, wouldn't it?
It's fabulous. I could have had one of the characters doing that.
Yeah, Stanley. I could see Stanley doing that for sure.
And the other thing was watching my grandmother.
I can tell you're familiar with my characters.
Yep.
The other thing was watching my grandmother beating eggs for her cake with a wire whisk. And
my mother did too.
Yeah, she had blue ribbons from the Iowa State Fair for her Inter-Food cake too. So yeah,
wonderful. Well, my mother didn't enter the fair, but she had wonderful, wonderful cakes.
Now, in some ways, it seemed like such an idyllic time. Was it really? Well,
for me, it was. The kid,
Yeah.
And since we did not have in my family, my brother was too young, my father was too old, so we did not suffer as many families did. But many people in our church certainly suffered through this, and I heard some of the stories. However, I was too young to understand the gravity of what was going on, and afterwards I certainly did.
Well, I remember going to newsreels, and because we didn't really know what was going on in Europe.
The concentration camps and things.
We didn't know that until they were liberated.
Right.
And but gosh, yeah.
Now
it came toward the end of the war, our awareness.
Yes.
And it was horrible, but we were unaware of that.
I'm curious, Ethel. You the family, the Andersens, have 5 children, 4 boys and a girl. And you take a point of view through most of the book of one of the sons.
Yes.
Rather than the daughter. What made you decide to do that?
Well, I wanted Ben to tell the story. He was the youngest boy, and I knew he was going to have to go. My husband's brother, my husband didn't go till Korea, but his brother next older than he, and I thought that was a good point of view. And even though I probably would identify more with the girls, I thought this is a war that was mostly, although there were wax waves and spars and nurses who certainly took a big part. But at the time, we were mostly thinking of our soldier boys, and so I gave the narrator role to Ben.
Well,
of the boys.
Of course, Betsy
and the twin of Betsy.
Yeah, Betsy being a historian and really an interesting character. I thought she added a great deal to it, just by the way that she encouraged her brothers and so forth. I thought.
I also found it really interesting. The character of the father, who had been to war, in World War I, and how that impacted him. And the way that you bring that story out was very touching.
Well, I thought that was important to include that because so many people today, coming back from warfare, we call it PSTD now. Back then, it was called shell shock in World War I, and it had another name in World War II. But it's the same thing, coming home just broken and having seen their friends die, and in a horrible way. So I felt it was important at least to include some of that, and the father did not want his sons to have to experience that same thing, but there was not much choice. They could have taken the farm deferment, but they chose not to because they felt their friends all had to go, and that they would go too.
Did you do much research on that about the farm deferment and whether people did go and how it was? I mean, in this book, in the Andersens of Eden, the farm boys who did take the deferment were criticized by the community. Was that common?
I got that idea from my husband, who's they were 4 boys in his family, just as there were in the Andersen family. But his not his oldest brother, but the next to the oldest, was a farmer. He was working. He didn't own a farm, but he was working on a farm, and he was offered the deferment, and he took it. And he experienced this. He didn't like to go to town because he experienced that feeling that you're not doing what we have to do, and we don't like it. Mm. So that's where I got that idea.
But in reality, without the farmers, there wouldn't be any food to feed the troops.
and many young men did take the farm deferment, and it was an honorable thing to do, and we needed it.
Yes.
But I used that particularly because of my brother-in-law that had experienced such a bad feeling.
Uh-huh.
Well, it's interesting because even many, many years later, when I married into an Iowa farm family, and I learned that there was still some resentment in the community between the families where the boys had gone to war and the ones where they stayed home. Because the ones
I didn't miss the mark too much.
No, the ones
because I really depended on my brother-in-laws.
Yeah,
the ones who stayed
that.
home,
And,
it actually continued. I mean, it wasn't just that they went off to war or didn't, but the ones who stayed home had a head start on buying up land and became the wealthier farmers of the community.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, I should have talked to you about that before I wrote the book. That's very interesting.
Yeah,
I hadn't thought about that, but of course that would be true. Yeah.
Sure. No, that is very. I'm getting so many stories now after the book, and I really enjoy it, hearing how people can identify with this family.
Did you have some source documents to refer to, letters from the front or anything like that?
The letters I had were not particularly illuminating. They were very humdrum, and everything interesting was blocked out.
Yeah. I saw some.
So mostly what I depended upon was my research. Books. We've got wonderful libraries in Iowa City, both the State Historical Society and our University Library and our public library, both in Iowa City and Coralville. And then I use the Internet for a lot of things, too. So whenever I hit a glitch, I had plenty of places to go and find information.
Was it hard sometimes to remember, technology has changed so quickly in your lifetime. Was it hard to remember what was available then and what wasn't? What things maybe didn't show up until 1950, and so you can't put them in, into the story in 1940?
No, it really wasn't, because I lived through it, and it was real easy to remember the things from school, the collecting the rubber and the metal and the milkweed, all those things, and buying the little war that we exchanged for war bonds. I remember doing that every week, bringing either a dime or a quarter, and hoping we would fill that book. And when it was full, I think it was $18.75 worth of little stamps. Then we could exchange it for a war bond that was worth $25. That seemed a huge amount of money to a kid back in those days. Yeah. And, of course, we'd save it for college. It sounds funny now, but back then, dollars, the value of dollars was so very different.
So did you use some of those war bonds for college?
Oh, yeah. I saved them. Of course, it cost more than that, but it was nice to have them.
Yeah.
And of course, my mother canned everything, and so did my grandmother. And then there was rationing. There was rationing of certain things.
Yes. We lived in my early childhood. Dad had a country congregation, but when I was a little bit older and it was still wartime, we moved to California, and a town of Salinas, California, and our home and our church were very close to downtown. I could just walk around the corner when Mother ran out of butter or eggs or something and get that for her, but I had to have my stamps for certain things.
Oh, yeah.
And also for shoes, for so many things, but I remember that very well, too.
Yeah.
So for those kinds of things, I didn't have to research.
You're listening to Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline, and we're speaking with Ethel Barker, author of The Andersens of Eden, the story of an Iowa family during World War II. Ethel, would you like to read from the book?
Oh, sure.
Oh, great.
I'm not sure. Just I'd have so many places I could read from, but I will read about when Clarence was missing in action. And then you tell me if I need to read something else, I will.
Okay.
Okay. As everybody else was talking about the war, a never-ending subject in our family, this is Ben, by the way, that's telling this story. A jalopy drove up the lane. I heard bits of gravel knocking about. It was an old 1928 Model A, long out of style, but nobody could buy a new car during the war. Carl Jensen drove it all over the county, delivering a telegram? No! There came a hard knock at the kitchen door, and Mom cried out, "No, Carl, no!" Claudia, Stanley, Betsy, and I all ran. Claudia's Clifford, the oldest boy's wife, by the way. Claudia, Stanley, Betsy, and I all ran into the kitchen and got there just in time to watch Carl Jensen, seed corn cap in his left hand with a face like folks show at a funeral, hand the telegram to Mom. He looked like he'd rather be anyplace else. Dad came running from the barn, leaping across puddles from the rain that had fallen the night before. Grandpa and Grandma hobbled in, white-faced, and for a moment all you could hear was the clock ticking. Mom ripped open the telegram and began to sob. Dad grabbed it and mumbled, "Clarence, missing in action." Claudia, that's Clarence's wife, went white as the head of a bald eagle, swaying like she was about to faint. But she didn't. Strangely, she was braver than the rest of us. Mom and Betsy were crying like crazy. Of course, Grandma was spouting Bible verses. Stanley, Dad, and Grandpa stood with their hands in their pockets as if they couldn't figure out what to do. Clarence had barely left the States. How could this happen? He wrote that he had a safe job. War is a crazy mess. Oh, how I hated this. We were used to solving all kinds of problems on the farm, but this was something we couldn't fix. Now, I'm going to skip a bit because they are suffering over this for several days until they get a phone call in the middle of the night. I will just read a bit here. All I could think of was Clarence missing in action. I hated, Stanley has been strutting around, so he hated, because Stanley is going to become a warrior. I hated watching Stanley strut around like that. Who do you think you are? General MacArthur? You're giving Mom palpitations. I'll most likely have to wait till after graduation, Stanley said, but I'm not sticking around like a draft dodger. Besides, you'll be here. Dad can't complain that he doesn't have help. You've turned into a better farmer than I'd ever be. The two of you will manage just fine. The message about Clarence left us feeling empty, and with all of Stanley's talk about joining up, it was even worse. I can't remember much of what we did the next 4 days. Seemed like besides doing chores, we often just sat in silence, except for Grandma's Bible verses, and I don't remember those either. Mom spent her nights by the radio knitting. After I went to bed, I couldn't sleep. Eventually, I was so worn out I did nod off. It was like being dead, but then one night, in one of the darkest hours, the phone rang. The usual 2 shorts and a long. Shook me up like butter in a churn. Our phone seldom rang in the day and never at night. Both Stanley and I popped out of bed. He 2 steps ahead of me. We raced down the stairs, and Stanley managed to get there before anybody else. The rest of the upstairs family came tumbling after me. In my drowsy state, I heard Stanley repeat what Carl Jensen had told him on the phone. Yup, ungodly hour, but I knew you'd want to know. Clarence is alive, not even hurt. Following those words, tears rang out like the ear-splitting noise at a football game after a touchdown. Stanley's reaction was different than what came out of the rest of us. Once he'd reported the news, he spun around and raced out the back door, slamming it behind him. I yanked it back and followed him into the darkness. There was moonlight enough that I could watch him run like a spooked horse down the driveway and in towards town in his bare feet, his blue-striped pajamas flapping like an American flag. The rest of the family came out. Even Grandpa and Grandma hobbled along from their little house out back. When we told them the wonderful news, they held each other and cried. Mom dug an elbow into Dad's side. Hadn't you better chase after Stanley? Nope, Dad said. The boy's high-strung. Got to do what he's got to do. I headed back to bed but couldn't sleep. Pretty soon I heard the church bell ringing. It rang at least 100 times, maybe more, chimes that sang out the way I felt, as if I was almost busting out of my skin. I ran back downstairs. Everybody was laughing, crying, and hugging each other like we'd all got killed, and then found out there really was a heaven. Waited up for Stanley to come home. When he finally did, he was breathless, and his feet were cut up and bloody. You shouldn't run barefoot on the gravel, Grandma said. Clarence's wife brought soap and a pan of water. She carefully washed Stanley's feet, dried them, and painted the cuts with mercurochrome, a kind and lovely gesture, and a sight I will never forget.
That was Ethel.
About the right amount.
That's great. That's Ethel Barker reading from the Andersens of Eden. So, Ethel, did you know kind of the outline of the story before you started writing?
No, I didn't. I don't write that way. Writing comes more naturally to me if I think up the characters and really build them up in my mind so they're real people to me, and then they act as they would act. Of course, there was a natural progression of this book because of the war, and I did have a timeline of all the things that happened during the war, all the battles, and so that really made it easy to fit the personal things around them. But no, I really just love to have the characters tell their own story.
Well, you do have a lot of World War II history in here.
Yes.
It would be a really fun way for kids to learn histories by reading this book.
It would, yeah. And to realize that
That's why I like to write historical fiction, because I have taught children that sometimes need a little encouragement to read, and if you can make it interesting and fun, they're much more likely to learn their history lesson as well.
Mm-hmm. Right. Because we were fighting on two fronts, which was very difficult.
Yes, it was, and toward the end of the book, there's more about the war in the Pacific.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So, Ethel, tell us about your path to publication. Now, this is your second book that you published. Was the first one also with Ice Cube Press?
Yes, it is. I think Ice Cube Press is wonderful, and I really like working with Steve Semken. And he had a very good intern that worked as an editor for me, and we had a great working relationship. So For the Love of Pete was the first book that I published with them. It's an orphan train story taking place in 1880 in Iowa. I love to write about Iowa, and it's children that were street kids in New York with not much going for them, and many of those children just died in the streets. And a wonderful opportunity came when Reverend Charles Loring Brace discovered the horror of the lives of these children. and arranged for the railroads were new, and he arranged for transportation to take them to various towns in the United States and even Canada and Mexico. And so the trains would stop. The children. It was a very unusual way to do this, but the children were displayed, and people came and the child and took them home.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, some of them didn't get very good homes, though.
That's right, and that happened to Pete in this story. But the little girls fared better, especially the little one, and I do like happy endings, so yeah, eventually we rescue Pete.
Now, have you always wanted to be a writer?
Oh, I've always loved writing, but I had not thought about doing that as a vocation. I just did it for fun. But it began going, well, I went for 10 years, I think, 10 summers, to the University of Iowa Writing Festival. And
Me too.
Learned a great deal there and about fiction writing. And then I just thought it was time to publish. And I met Steve Semkin of Ice Cube Press, and it's been wonderful ever since.
Oh, wow. So you're working on another book now?
Yes, I am.
Is it also a historical novel?
It is about Iowa as well, and I'm going farther back in history to 1835.
Ooh.
This is before we were a state or even a territory. We were part of the Michigan territory at that time. And so there's all kinds of adventures can come to. Two families coming out in their covered wagon from Ohio. And so I'm having a lot of fun doing that.
Well, part of our family came by covered wagon from Ohio.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And
where did they come from?
I'd have to look it up, but I have a dresser in my bedroom. It's a cherry dresser, and there's a card on the back that says this dresser came on covered wagon from Ohio.
No kidding, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Oh, I would love to have more of your family history because I keep learning more and more as I go along. There is surprising the amount of information that is available.
I will send you some because we have a lot. Our family did come to Iowa about that time in the mid 1800s. And we have a lot of information.
Is there a Belmont?
I would love that.
Is there a Belmont county in Ohio?
That sounds right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But we'll look it up. We've had people some of our ancestors did all the genealogy, and we have all the information going way back.
Oh, send me whatever you can.
I will.
I would love that.
Okay, great.
Wonderful. Well, Ethel, it's been such a pleasure having you today. The Andersens of Eden, the story of an Iowa family during World War II. And this is available at icecubepress.com and also any bookstore could order it. Right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
All right. And, Mom, do you have some closing words for us today?
I do. Is actually about war. When the power of love overcomes the love of power, the world will have peace.
Do you know who said that?
Nope.
No.
Well, let's just hope it comes true.
Amen.
Stay tuned now if you're listening. We'll see you next week on Writers' Voices.
Thanks so much.